Let's look at the case at hand. It stems from the government's current handling of the proposed policy for the extradition of asylum seekers to Malaysia in conjunction with the placement of reporting for political achievement. This short film will explore the demonisation of asylum seekers and the government's policy in relation with current news stories in circulation. Presently, the Labour government has come under fire with ethical issues with the Malaysian asylum seeker swap being deemed not in conjunction with the UN policy that Australia has signed. The media went a bit crazy the day after the High Court ruled against the Australian government, and I'll be looking at several newspaper articles by The Australian, The Daily Telegraph, The Courier Mail and The Sydney Morning Herald. Who are the stakeholders? Well, they are the newspaper gatekeepers, media gatekeepers, the Labour government, LNP, asylum seekers and the general public. Now this brings up an interesting question. What are the responsibilities the media has in representing asylum seekers and what are the ramifications it has on the general public? So I decided to hit up the University of Queensland student body to hear their thoughts on asylum seekers.
I probably watch Channel 10 News the most from about 5 PM of an afternoon till about 7:30, so about 2.5 hours of news, and not a big fan of asylum seekers in general. I think there's always a place for refugees, but you know, I guess I do have that view that they're queue jumpers, even though it's a bit politically incorrect. I really do think that genuine refugees are missing out on a chance to come to Australia because of these people, but at the same time I think we've got a bigger capacity to take in more refugees.
Okay, so I get my news predominantly online, usually from ABC, Fairfax newspapers and The Guardian / New York Times. My opinion on asylum seekers is that if they are desperate enough to get boats to come over to Australia, they should just be processed in Australia. I think the Malaysian deal has a lot of issues, and that by definition asylum seekers are people who are seeking asylum, so they are not just random people who decide to put their lives at risk to come over here. So I think, yes, that's what I think.
I don't know. Asylum seekers, it's actually something I really don't have much of an opinion on. I guess you'd have to put yourself in their shoes. You just came from a world where you watch your father get shot for food stamps, and then they come here and they get more benefits than the average Australian citizen, like free education and stuff, which is kind of weird, so it makes me want to resent them. I guess my ambiguity towards the whole question of it is kind of a clear example of the fact that it's not being handled properly, because I don't have a clear view of how it should be done.
I get most of my news from news.com.au, and when I'm in the car I listen to Nova and B105, so I get my news when they're on. What do I think about asylum seekers? Well, I don't actually know too much about the issue, but I think it's a good idea to at least check out their, find out if they actually are refugees and not just for the sake of it. And I think sort of setting up in Malaysia is a good idea rather than letting them stay in the country.
I get all my news sources from news.com, generally Channel 10 news shows, so the afternoon news, 6:30 with George and Nikas, sometimes 7:30 projects, 7 PM projects. And in terms of asylum seekers and boat people, I feel that perhaps they should be processed here just because we have a better system as opposed to Malaysia.
The asylum seekers that are the boat people that come to Australia, they are not legal. They are illegal and they should be sent back to Malaysia. Anyway, when they're allowed to Australia, it's creating confusion and stereotyping that refugees from Africa, from other places that come under legal humanitarian visas, they are seen as innocent port. So I think that the government should just deport them back to where they come from.
I generally get all of my news online. I go to Press Display a lot, have a look at whatever papers are on there, and just basically look at anything that interests me. I don't really know very much about the asylum seekers or about people, not necessarily because it isn't in the news sources that I look at, but more because it's just not something that I personally go through and seek out.
Primarily listen to ABC 612 radio, Brisbane. and I consume online articles as well from various different sources, primarily Australian. My thoughts on asylum seekers. Basically, if we can help people who are coming from countries that are suffering from conflict, whether it be political or anything like that, I think we should help them as human beings.
I think it's a good thing because Malaysia is quite well developed. I mean, I've been there many times, and I think it's quite a good sort of setting and location for them to be shipped over to Australia. Really, simple as that. What news stations do I listen to? Just mainly whatever my mum listens to, really, like B105, ABC, stuff like that, in the car on the way to uni. That's about it, really.
Yeah, I think it's a new low for the Australian government. The Labor Party is sending refugees to places where they know abuses happen. Amnesty International did a great expose on them, the Malaysian detention camps a few years ago. There's systemic and widespread abuse. Refugees are publicly flogged, basically used as slave labour. The average length of time for the majority of refugees in Malaysian detention camps are years, sometimes decades. And the fact that the Australian government is sending people coming to Australia looking for help and basic humanity to these hellholes, these hells on earth, is absolutely a disgrace, and I am totally opposed to the Malaysian solution. I think refugees should be processed here and treated humanely.
Top story on ABC News Breakfast. The fate of a group of asylum seekers to be sent to Malaysia will be decided today. The High Court will hand down its decision on the federal government's controversial refugee swap deal with Malaysia this afternoon.
Refugee lawyers argue Australia risks breaching its international obligations because Malaysia hasn't signed the UN Refugee Convention. But the government says the agreement ensures asylum seekers will be protected.
Well, the court has upheld all of the applications made by the plaintiffs. So on the first ground, the court has found that the Minister's declaration under the Migration Act is invalid.
Ethically, the large contributing factor is the government's underhanded demonisation of asylum seekers, leading to the placement of harsh colloquialisms and poor representation of the situation at hand. We did have a lot of people agree and not agree with offshore processing, but however, more people than not didn't know too much about the situation. They didn't know about the facts and figures. It was more opinion based. So does this mean that the media is not doing its job properly? And is this ethical? So I decided to go down and have a chat to a couple of professionals about the Malaysian asylum seeker deal. I spoke to media expert Dr. Nicholas Kara, and I also had a chat to Dr. Peter Billings and Marissa Doris from the Asylum and Refugee Law Project base at UQ.
There's this kind of chicken and egg thing, the extent to, to what extent do the media cause or create this kind of public outrage? To what extent do they just circulate already existing outrage? To what extent do they amplify outrage? I think there's this theory, the spiral of silence, and I think that what the media does by putting forward its point of view is, and in such a kind of deliberate and continuous way over a 10-15 year period, is that they make it okay for people who share that view to speak really loudly and to speak it like it's the truth. And what it does is kind of close out the space within which other people might say, you know what, I don't think that's the case. And I think the other thing you get is then a polarisation. So people who feel strongly about the asylum seeker issue, either in a kind of, pro or anti-asylum seeker positions, tend to kind of polarise towards, liberal or conservative media. And they basically talk to people who they already agree with about the issue, and it kind of reinforces their sense that they're right and there are these other people that are wrong. So what we have is a completely polarised, completely unproductive debate about asylum seekers in Australia. It's that the Courier Mail, they're a tabloid press and they're going to report like that, and other, while their audience really likes it, some people will say it's unethical or it amplifies bad sentiments or whatever it is. But I think the issue is, if we look more broadly, that the government also attacked the High Court's decision in a similar way. If you go and look at what Minister Bowen said, what the Prime Minister said, they also basically said, the High Court decision enables the people smugglers' business model to continue and so on. So I don't think you can just explicitly blame the press. I think it's more a question of the extent to which the political process and the media process respects the separation of powers, respects the High Court, and I think it's important that respect for those institutions are maintained in terms of maintaining our social cohesion and faith in the political process.
Of course, what's significant and what has come to light subsequently is the fact that what the Howard government did on Nauru for a number of years, and what Tony Abbott was purporting to do in sending people to Nauru in the future, would also be unlawful, given the way that the High Court has interpreted the Migration Act. The reason that the Howard government's so-called Pacific solution, particularly sending people to Nauru, was able to continue for so many years was because it simply wasn't challenged in this way in the courts. The High Court has now effectively said processing people on Nauru is off limits, or at least you have to satisfy the court that there are effective human rights protections in place in Nauru. They've set the bar very high. If Nauru is to be used, or PNG or Manus Island, they've set the bar very high for the government to demonstrate that those countries are fully compliant with relevant human rights standards. So effectively, without an amendment to the Migration Act, offshore processing is dead in the water. Now, of course, Australia, as far as I know, is the only country in the world that processes asylum seekers offshore. So it would actually be falling into line with other liberal democracies in processing asylum seekers onshore. It's actually more cost effective to do that. Offshore processing is hugely expensive. And arguably, it's a more humane approach, because offshore processing on Nauru gave rise to serious mental health concerns for many of the detainees who were held on that island. And it doesn't work as a deterrent. And that's another reason given for offshore processing. It doesn't work as a deterrent, as is often claimed. So we're now in a position where the Labour government would still like to pursue the so-called Malaysian solution, but that's seemingly unlikely now given the High Court's decision. There's a suggestion they might amend the Migration Act to enable them to do so. The Liberal coalition, on the other hand, would be keen to resuscitate Nauru as a place where people are processed. That is also seemingly problematical given the High Court's decision in M70. So we're in a space where we're uncertain what is going to occur going forward. The Greens would say, let's bring people onshore and process them here. That would be certainly the most cost-effective thing to do. But it would also be worth, I think, directing resources to Indonesia and Malaysia to help with the processing of people there. If you speed the process up in Indonesia and Malaysia, people are less likely to get on boats. People get on boats because they're frustrated with the time it takes to process their cases in those countries. Now that would be some kind of solution to the problem of large numbers of displaced people being in countries like Indonesia. Malaysia isn't a signatory to the 1951 Convention, and that informed the High Court in coming to its view that Malaysia wasn't a country that offered effective protection for asylum seekers, and therefore the minister couldn't make a valid declaration under the Migration Act. So the issue here is that the minister hasn't acted in accordance with law, and that's why the High Court's restrained the government from sending adults and unaccompanied children back to Malaysia.
So basically what the High Court decided last Wednesday, or on Wednesday the 31st of August, was that it was unlawful for the government to send people to a country and to hand over our obligations to process refugees or to process asylum seekers to a country that didn't, in law, recognise the status of refugees, the status of asylum seekers, and the guarantee of certain rights to those people. So Malaysia was a really extreme example. But it basically demonstrates that the High Court was not willing to allow Australia to skirt our international obligations by sending people to countries that in international law and in their own domestic law did not recognise the status of refugees. So that's what that agreement was about. It could have been very different if the government had made a binding international agreement with Malaysia, So on the 25th of July, when that was published, the agreement was said to be specifically non-binding. It could have been different if Malaysia had signed the Refugee Convention, and it could have been different if Malaysia had, in its domestic laws, made some recognition of refugees as a status or asylum seekers as a status. But given that neither in domestic or international law Malaysia recognised any legal obligation to refugees or asylum seekers, the High Court found that it was not legal for the government to send people to Malaysia.
Now, the first theory I'm going to look at is W.D. Ross's idea of non-malfeasance. How did the media represent the situation? Is it helping or not helping the idea of refugees based in Australia, and is it blurring the line of who and who is not seeking asylum?
Let's break down non-malfeasance, also known as non-injury. It is the duty not to physically or psychologically harm others. Now, you can avoid harming their health, security, intelligence, character, or happiness. Let's have a look at the Courier Mail's front page spread. High alert, Navy braces for flood of boat arrivals after Malaysian deal banned. The editor and the journalist of the Courier Mail are not in line with non-malfeasance. This article is sensationalised. It causes harm to asylum seekers' integration into Australia, which is harming their happiness and security. To grab a few lines from the article, the Courier Mail can reveal that according to intelligence reports, at least 4 illegal vessels are preparing to depart Indonesia within days, carrying between 30 to 70 asylum seekers each. With that feel and writing style within the article, it brings the reader a strong sense of animosity towards asylum seekers as it frames the situation as an invasion. Now over to the Australian, with the headline, Labor's Asylum Solution All at Sea. Opposed to the Courier Mail, the Australian editorial team does follow non-malfeasance. The article was more so focused on the government's blunder and the facts and the figures. At no real point within the article does it target asylum seekers and demonise the situation to the public sphere. The article has taglines such as urgent legal advice and going back to the Howard era. The article really gives a fair and non-biased look on the Malaysian deal fiasco. The Sydney Morning Herald is similar to the Australian with no skewing of data, no information in the article where it will contradict non-malfeasance framework and once again targeting the Labor government. The headline is High Court Sinks Asylum Strategy. There is no menace to this article onto asylum seekers. However, it illustrates the government's struggle with the quote, let's make no bones about it, today's decision by the High Court is a profoundly disappointing one. Last but not least, let's have a look at the Daily Telegraph, which is more in line with sensationalised news. The headline is left high and dry. The article does talk about the government's political blunder, but it places the image in mind that the asylum seekers are coming over in waves of an invasion, which is breaking the same rules as the Courier Mail did with the framework of non-malfeasance. To grab the starting line to illustrate my point, an Australian Navy officer yesterday declared it open season for people smugglers as the government was left reeling by the High Court's decision to scuttle its Malaysian solution. The article is stating that the Navy is now on high alert, which means that this is starting up animosity towards asylum seekers, which is mentally affecting the security of and the happiness of asylum seekers within the public arena.
Okay, now let's look at Kant's categorical imperative, and let's see how it can be used. Now, Kant's categorical imperative is the notion that the action or inaction of a situation is necessary. Now, meaning, can the public actually use reversibility to place themselves in the shoes of an asylum seeker, or is this halted by the media's demonisation of asylum seekers?
Now, before continuing, we must note that Kant's categorical imperative is derived from monistic deontology. Kant has 3 formulas.
Act only according to the maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. The second formula, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in a person of any other, neither merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. The third formula, therefore, every rational being must so act as if he, through his maxim, always a legislating member in the universal kingdom ends. Now let's look through Kant's categorical imperative through the window of reversibility. Most of the articles in the Daily Telegraph, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Courier Mail, and the Australian do not consider reversibility. The content in these papers only show relatable material, even though that is the primary rule for readership for a newspaper in Australia. However, it only gives one side of the asylum debate. The Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald are not so one-sided as the Daily Telegraph and the Courier Mail, but still bend the ethical boundaries that are being bent in terms of deontological practices. Now let's move on to virtual ethics. Now let's have a look at who the moral agents are. When talking about moral agents, we want to break down the 4 papers I'm reviewing. The moral agents are the editors and the journalists. Virtue ethics. Ethical behaviour is driven by the moral choice, opposed to pluralistic and monistic deontological practices and consequentialism. The difference between virtue ethics and any other framework is the moral choice. It is not about the negative ramifications, and is also not about the outcome. It is about the choice to tell the truth, or to skew the facts. With the interviews I had with Dr. Peter Billings and Dr. Nicholas Carra, it was evident to me that our media outlets don't really follow deontological frameworks for ethical guidelines. You can argue that the journalists are writing for the 4 papers in discussion are making choices via virtual ethics. They are not really making choices the way it's going to be perceived or the consequence. They are making the choice to make that subject matter. As deontologists see, telling untruths are forbidden, and consequences look more at the outcome. So my conclusion is that these papers are based on virtual ethics. What is the alternative solution? As Peter Billings mentioned before, if you can speed up the process for asylum seekers overseas, then there would be a reduction of the number of boats entering Australia. However, we live in an imperfect world, and the likelihood of faster processing is lacking in the near future. So how should we tackle the issue of demonisation in Australian media? Well, it's quite a hard topic to directly cut into clear, understandable lines of thought. However, here is a list of potential solutions. The first solution would to be use a more monistic deontological practice such as Kant's categorical imperative. Treat others how you wish to be treated. Pretty much reversibility, meaning the journalists put themselves in the feet of persecution while trying to escape war and political oppression whilst writing articles on asylum seekers. The second solution is to think about consequentialism frameworks. If an article is passed through the gatekeeper, how is this going to affect the public? What will this create, and will this create animosity? Having a solution to this is easier said than done. At the moment, the public are not particularly clued up on asylum seekers, and the government has a political agenda, and media tends to demonise the situation. The only way for this ethical issue to disappear is more non-biased and factual articles presented by the Australian media.